On February 27th in the year 1505, the King of Portugal, Manuel I, called for a grand assembly. There he wanted to announce his new plan for the conquest of the Indian Ocean. The upper echelon of society quickly congregated into the sovereign's presence to hear his audacious strategy, which would be known as the regimento. From the crowd, two men emerged and approached the king as they were commanded. They were father and son. The older man, Francisco de Almeida, was in his mid-50s. He was a formidable figure who had distinguished himself many times on the field of battle. The younger man, Lourenço de Almeida, Francisco's only son, was in his mid-20s. He was dashing and handsome, intelligent and resourceful. Most of all, he was eager to prove himself to his king, to his country, but especially to his father. The king then brought Francisco closer, and there, in front of this distinguished entourage, he proclaimed him the first viceroy of India, essentially the king's proxy. Lourenço, who was standing a few feet behind, watched with pride and absolute awe of his father as he was granted so high a title. It was later, after the fanfare had ended, that the two men, along with the rest of the high nobility, were ushered into a private chamber where the king began to outline his plan in detail. It was an absolutely bold strategy that bordered on outright arrogance, but it showed that the Portuguese insight into the world of the Indian Ocean was indeed impressive. In less than 1 decade, the Iberian Kingdom had obtained vast amounts of knowledge into the commerce, the vital ports, and the politics of the East. And now King Manuel I was ready to exploit that knowledge. Portugal was not out to simply just trade anymore. It was determined to establish an empire. The regimento would unfold in several stages. Francisco de Almeida was first ordered to take the Swahili coast in East Africa. There he would establish a series of forts at critical port cities where the trade routes of Africa ended. Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, Malindi, the list went on. Then the viceroy was instructed to secure allies along the coast of India with another series of forts. Anjadiva, Chaul, Kannur, Colombo, Cochin. Again, the list went on. It was at this point that Gaspar da Gama, the godson of Vasco da Gama, who was at this point regarded as a veteran of Portuguese expansion, a man who had considerable knowledge of the Indian Ocean, not to mention the king's ear, interjected. He convinced King Manuel I that he also needed to go for the heart of Islamic trade. Therefore, blockading the Red Sea where it bottlenecks at its southern end and thereby cutting off all trade to Cairo and Mecca became an extremely high priority in the regimento. Of course, the holy war against Islam would also continue unabated. King Manuel would say to Almeida, "All India should be stripped of the illusion of being able to trade with anyone but ourselves. Expel the Muslims, and if not, wage total war and destruction on them by any means you can on land and sea, so that everything possible is destroyed." In later phases of the Grand Plan, fleets of Portuguese ships would be sent in to patrol the waters and extract annual tribute. Almeida was then ordered to seek out new life and new civilization by pushing the final frontiers of Portugal beyond the subcontinent of India. Ceylon, Malacca, Japan, China, yet again the list went on. As Roger Crowley would put it, it was a mission of war disguised as peace. King Manuel's ambition was enormous. He was convinced it was simply his divine right that this would all be accomplished. Of course, the man he picked for the job was the perfect choice. Roger Crowley, in his book The Conquerors, explains, quote, Almeida was to be the first member of high nobility to lead an India expedition. He was about 55 years old with wide military, diplomatic, and nautical experience. But he also possessed the personal qualities that King Manuel hoped for. Almeida was incorruptible. He was unmoved by the lure of riches. He was benevolent, a widower without ties to home, pious, and mature in his judgments. For many, the attraction of India was the prospect of personal gain. Almeida, on the other hand, was untarnished by the appetites of lesser men. He valued titles above bales of spice. And, most importantly, he knew how to fight. End quote. On March 25, 1505, the new viceroy of India walked down a triumphant procession with his son. As they made their way, the king and the aristocracy gave them their blessing. Both father and son were impressively dressed for the occasion. It was a clear message to everyone: the Almeida family would be commanding this voyage. The Armada set out from Lisbon. It was massive, 21 ships with over 1,500 men. It was so big that even a few women managed to sneak on board. At the helm were experienced sailors and captains. Some had already made the India run before. Among the crews was Gaspar da Gama, who had joined the voyage to add his experience. But also included in the roster was one Ferdinand Magellan, who was there to gain experience. This, by the way, was the very same man who would one day get the credit for being the first to circumnavigate the world, albeit he did it under a different flag and, well, for another country. The Portuguese Armada passed the coast of northwest Africa before beginning its looping maneuver to the southwest. On the way to Brazil, however, a ship was lost to storms. Moving through the South Atlantic and braving the dangerous high-pressure zones that were there, the rest of the ships managed to round the Cape of Good Hope in late June. The Armada then rounded the tip of Africa and made its way north into the Mozambique Channel. On July 22, 1505, it arrived at Kilwa. Kilwa was a prize. It was a beautiful city. It was a major hub where the trade routes to East Africa ended. Its busy port also conducted commerce with Arabia, Persia, and with the Gujarati cities in distant India. Gold, cotton, cloth, incense, silver, gems, and of course, in its time, the most precious substance in the universe, spice, were commonplace on its wharfs. Now, 3 years prior, Vasco da Gama had come to the city. At that time, he demanded that the Sultan pay a hefty tribute and fly the Portuguese flag from its tallest tower. However, when Francisco arrived, the tribute had not been paid for 2 years, and there was no flag to be seen. This made the viceroy, well, unhappy, and he demanded an immediate audience. The Sultan, in response, gave him a really weak excuse. Thus, 2 days later, on July 24th at dawn, Francisco Almeida stepped down from his ship adorned in his finest suit of armor, holding the Portuguese flag in one hand and a sword in the other. At the head of his troops, he uttered the word, "Attack," and with that, his men surged forward. Francisco smiled and looked on with pride as he watched his son Lourenço lead a contingent of men into the heart of the city. There they pillaged and destroyed as they went, brushing aside all resistance. When they arrived at the palace, they found it empty. The Sultan had already fled. The Portuguese then began to loot the city. The king's share, of course, was sent back to Lisbon. Over the next 2 weeks, an impressive fort was built in the city, built of stone, ironically taken from the houses that they had just destroyed. A garrison was assigned, a puppet ruler was put in place, and with that, the first objective of the regimento had been accomplished. With Kilwa secured, Francisco Almeida deployed some of his ships south to take Sofala. There, they would rendezvous with a fresh incoming Portuguese fleet. That city would eventually be taken and another fort would be constructed. With the acquisition of Sofala, the Portuguese would have one more impressive hub of the East African trade. Now, for the viceroy and his armada, it was time to move on. King Manuel's plan now called for the viceroy to head directly to India. However, Francisco had decided that he wanted to secure one more foothold in Africa before he left. Mombasa had always been a thorn in the side of the Portuguese, and now it was outright hostile. Like Kilwa and Sofala, it was a major hub of trade which had grown rich and powerful. The Sultan had encountered the Portuguese before. He had wisely prepared for their return. The defenses of the city were fortified, cannons were brought in and installed, and a large garrison was put in place. As Almeida entered into the harbor, which, by the way, was one of the finest in East Africa, the Sultan of Mombasa opened fire with his cannons. In that first shot, he got really lucky. The salvo hit the lead ship and gouged a massive hole in the upper deck, killing all the men inside. However, for the Sultan, it was going to be all downhill from there. The Portuguese armada came alive and returned fire. One fortunate cannonball somehow managed to penetrate through the city walls and hit Mombasa's powder magazine. The catastrophic explosion that ensued rattled the ground like an earthquake and silenced the city's artillery. What happened next was truly a test of willpower. The Sultan had an army of over 4,000 men at his command, and he was determined to hold his ground. Francisco de Almeida, on the other hand, had the initiative, and he was just as determined to take the city. Thus, the armada was ordered to move in for the kill. As it approached the city, it began to unload its soldiers, and then the great assault began. Fighting was intensely fierce in the narrow passageways and small corridors. The Sultan's men fought heroically, street to street, house to house. Almeida, seeing his men and his offensive begin to falter, came up with a new tactic. He had his men roll barrels of gunpowder down from the ships. He then ordered the gunpowder to be placed into various buildings in the city upwind from his opponent. When the powder was ignited, fires broke out. The wind then carried the flames toward the Sultan and his men, and soon all of Mombasa was engulfed in a firestorm. A chronicler of the time who witnessed the event would comment, quote, "The fire that ran throughout the city burned all that afternoon and into the night that followed. It seemed as if the whole city was on fire. There was enormous destruction. The wooden houses burned to the ground, and those of stone and mortar caught fire and crashed down as well, and in them great riches and people were destroyed." End quote. Despite this, the Sultan fought on. At one point, he even had his men release wild elephants to stampede the men of Portugal. But Almeida had already turned the tide. For him, it was always about victory at any cost. The very next day, he deployed his men into a devastating four-pronged assault against the defenders of the city. His plan worked perfectly, and the Sultan of Mombasa was forced to run. A few days later, when the dust had settled, envoys were sent back and forth between the two men, and a peace treaty was struck. Mombasa was now firmly under the jurisdiction of the Portuguese. Its fine harbor was part of the empire. What's more, the Sultan would have to pay a massive tribute. But even before the ink was dry on the treaty, the plunder had begun. Almeida wisely divided the great city into areas, one for each of his captains. The subsequent pillaging was especially vicious, but it was efficient. When the Europeans were done, there was almost nothing left. In a letter that he wrote to the King of Malindi, the Sultan of Mombasa would lament, quote, "I will have you know that a great lord passed here, burning with fire. He entered the city so forcefully and cruelly that he spared the life of none, man or woman, young or old, or children, no matter how small. Not only were men killed and burned, but the birds of heaven fell to the earth. In this city, the stench of death is such that I dare not enter, and none could give account or assess the infinite wealth that he took." End quote. On August 23, 1505, Almeida left Africa. Sofala, Kilwa, Mombasa were all taken. Malindi remained a faithful ally. The viceroy had left behind him a path of death and destruction, but his focus was what lay ahead, and there before him was the path to India. The Portuguese position in India at this time was precarious at best. Portugal only had a few settlements, one in Kannur, another in Colombo, and a fort in Cochin, which, by the way, only escaped a narrow destruction through the genius of its defense by Duarte Pacheco Pereira the year before. Many cities remained hostile, including Diu, Dabul, Chaul, and especially the great rival, Calicut. Francisco de Almeida got right to work after arriving along the Malabar coast in late August of 1505. He initially arrived at Anjadiva Island, which was a watering stop for ships conducting trade along the coast, and there he began construction of another fort. 1 month later, as the fort was nearing completion, Francisco decided to move south to the city of Onovar. But there, a disagreement with its Raja over a shipload of horses spiraled out of control and broke out into a massive fight. Violence spilled out across the entire city. The viceroy at one point was hit in the foot with an arrow, and so he looked to his son to finish the job. Lourenço was deployed with his men. For him, it was a chance to really prove himself. But taking a page from his own father, half the city was laid to waste before the young Almeida emerged victorious, though he did come close to dying a few times along the way. From the locals, he gained the nickname the Devil for how fierce, some would argue how reckless, his attacks were. But that said, the shock and awe worked. The Raja of Anavar sued for peace. An annual tribute was imposed. The Raja just didn't want to see that level of aggression from Iberian men that he now thought were somewhat insane. Now, during the assault, several ships were damaged or destroyed in the harbor. Some of these belonged to a prominent pirate named Timoji. This man had encountered Vasco da Gama before and knew how powerful the Portuguese could be, but seeing firsthand the destruction at Anavar, the pirate decided it would be in his best interest to give his allegiance to Portugal. From that time onwards, he would serve as a major informant. Remember the name. With things settled at Anavar, the viceroy made his way south to the port city of Canor, where he feared a merchant uprising would undermine Portuguese authority. His very presence, along with his armada, changed the mood quickly. In a week-long stay, he met several times with the Kolatiri Raja and began preparations for a fortress there, along with a garrison to man it. During his time in Canor, delegations and envoys from other cities would also meet up with Francisco, where they'd enter into negotiations to open up even new ports to the Europeans. Now, in early November of 1505, Almeida found himself in Cochin, which was to be a cornerstone of the Portuguese Empire. There, he met up with the new Trimampara Raja. The prior one, who had fought at the siege of Cochin, had already retired. The two men's first order of business was to expand and upgrade the fort at the mouth of the harbor. Roger Crawley would say, rulers up and down the Malabar coast were to find that once the Franks were ensconced behind solid ramparts, with artillery mounted on stout gun platforms, they proved almost impossible to dislodge. For the rest of 1505, Almeida and his son would turn their attention to ravaging Muslim shipping along the Malabar coast. The destruction they handed out was impressive. In response, the Arabian captains diverted their ships down to the Maldives. Their hope was that they could get around the Armada. Of course, the viceroy was not going to let that slide. Lourenço de Almeida was sent by his father to cut off this route. However, the water currents in this area were unknown to the Portuguese and would carry his fleet far to the east. There, Lourenço would be the first man of his country to make landfall in Ceylon, that is modern-day Sri Lanka. Like his father, he went right to work. He established a treaty with the local Raja, began trade negotiations, and laid down an early settlement. His diplomatic initiative was so good that 12 years later, a Portuguese fortress would also be added. In the final months of 1505, Francisco turned his attention to loading his ships with spice for the return journey. Even the aging Carac, the Flor de la Mar, was filled to capacity. The haul that the viceroy sent back to Lisbon was one of the greatest King Manuel would ever see. The yield in terms of cash was astronomical. Almeida had accomplished many of the goals of the Regimento, only the full blockade of the Red Sea was lacking, something, by the way, that would come back to haunt him on several levels. But despite his hard work, his efforts would go largely unappreciated. Back in Lisbon, the intrigue of the Portuguese court was turning against the viceroy. There were those in the nobility that were consumed with greed, jealousy, or simply malevolence. Several members of the high aristocracy had come forth to turn the king's favor away from Francisco de Almeida. In fact, by February of 1506, King Manuel had already chosen a replacement and had begun to view Almeida with suspicion. Early that year, Alfonso de Albuquerque, who had gained the king's confidence, was dispatched with a powerful fleet. In his hand, he carried a letter from the king, which granted him the title of governor and effectively ended the viceroy's time in power. Meanwhile, back in the Indian Ocean, the beginning of 1506 saw Francisco de Almeida hit a high point, yet he knew that trouble was brewing. The Zamorin of Calicut, also known as the Samudri Raja, who happened to be the biggest rival of the Portuguese, had sent a fleet to Canor to blockade the harbor. In March of 1506, Lourenço de Almeida sailed in. There he annihilated the Zamorin's fleet. But despite this victory, confidence in Portuguese supremacy was waning. Arab shipping, after all, was still getting through, the navies of the Indian Ocean were using more cannons, and new enemies were emerging. In the north, the Sultan of Bijapur, who owned the city of Dabul, was not happy with the Portuguese fortress at Anjadiva, which, to be fair, was intruding on the commerce of his city. In a well-timed and coordinated attack just before the monsoons came, the Sultan bombarded the fortress, shelled the people inside, and destroyed 3 nearby ships. His assault went unopposed for several days, and the garrison was at his mercy. Roger Crowley explained what happened next. Quote, Lorenzo was dispatched and forced a withdrawal of the Sultan's ships, but it was clear that the fort was unsustainable, too close to hostile Bijapur, too short of natural resources. At the end of the year, Almeida took the decision, without reference to manual, to abandon and dismantle the structure. It was a riposte to the wisdom of the grand plan, and it did not go down well. At the same time, it gave hope to Muslim merchants that the Portuguese could indeed be dislodged. End quote. The story of Anjadiva empowered Portugal's enemies, who were all just waiting for the chance to strike. That strike would come sooner than Francisco anticipated. It was towards the end of 1506 when Lorenzo was leading a fleet of ships towards the city of Chaul. They had stopped along the way to dismantle the Anjadiva fort. Suddenly, they were approached by merchants from Cochin and Kannur, their allies. The merchants stated that their ships, laden down with spice, had been blockaded into the harbor of the city of Dabul by the ships of Arabia and Calicut. They demanded that the Portuguese live up to their reputation, sail in, and help them immediately. Lorenzo wanted to rush in, but he was under orders to have a meeting with his captains to vote on the course of action. After a very heated debate, the final tally was 6-4 not to attack. It was argued that the harbor of Dabul was not well known, and this could all simply be a trap. The young Almeida was forced to agree with the decision, but he made all the captains sign their vote. Thus, their names were recorded. The book Conquerors describes the aftermath of this fateful decision. Quote, The inevitable happened. The friendly merchantmen were sacked, their crews killed, and their valuable cargo confiscated. The ships of Calicut fired mocking shots as they sailed away. For the first time, the Portuguese had flunked a fight. The refusal to protect their ships was taken badly in friendly Malabar ports. Not to mention, Francisco de Almeida was appalled by the news. End quote. All along the Malabar coast, the Portuguese position was now in jeopardy. Allies went cold, envoys ceased coming, and there were demands by the locals to go back to trading only with the ships of Mecca, which, if nothing else, had been reliable in the past. Indeed, even a major revolt broke out in Kannur in 1507 with anti-Portuguese sentiment, which, by the way, needed a considerable amount of resources to put down. Now, when news of this got back to Lisbon, the viceroy's opponents in the royal court had a field day, and saying that the king was displeased was an understatement. Francisco de Almeida rounded up all the men who had voted not to attack at Dabul. This included his son. All of these men were court-martialed. Some were sent back to Europe in utter disgrace, labeled as cowards. Others were imprisoned. When it came to Lorenzo, the viceroy just couldn't get himself to sign the order to have him banished. Perhaps it was simply nepotism, or perhaps he just couldn't bear the thought of seeing his only son go. Instead, Lorenzo was stripped of command and demoted. As the young man walked past his father, he just couldn't get himself to meet his gaze. The sense of failure and regret, of letting down the one man whose opinion mattered most, was just too much for him to bear. The young Almeida was placed in charge of a small flotilla and given convoy duty. He resigned himself to his fate, but every fiber of his being longed for redemption. The thought consumed him. For 1 full year, Lorenzo did his duty, but he kept looking for a chance to redeem himself in his father's eyes. In March of 1508, Lorenzo de Almeida found himself in the port city of Chaul, which was not exactly a friendly port. Now, little did he, or for that matter his father, know, but approximately 200 miles to the northwest in the city of Diu was a massive Muslim armada. It had been built in the shipyards of the Mamluk Sultanate, traveled down the Red Sea, and had managed to evade all Portuguese ships. The Mamluk Armada had been in the Indian Ocean for months, and no one in the Portuguese High Command knew anything about it. When spies reported that the viceroy's son was in Chaul and only had a handful of ships, it was way too tempting a target. The Muslim Armada immediately set sail for Chaul. Lourenço de Almeida would get his chance for redemption, and he would pay for it with his own blood. It was nearing the end of the sailing season in March of 1508. By now, temperatures had risen dramatically and the humidity had become intense. It wouldn't be long before the monsoons would come and shut down all seagoing commerce. It was in the harbor of the city of Chaul that the ships of Cochin were being loaded with cargo. Their hope was to beat the weather and get in one last trading run. Lourenço de Almeida, the son of the viceroy, was there to provide protection for the cargo ships. The man had been demoted and assigned to basic convoy duty for over a year by his own father. This was punishment for his prior failure in 1506 to protect Portuguese allies at the city of Diu. Lourenço was now in command of 3 small carracks, 3 caravels, and 2 galleys, crewed by approximately 500 men, which at this point was, well, a relatively small Portuguese fleet. Now, prior to his arrival at Chaul, the young Almeida and his men, in the spirit of holy war, had raided enemy ships along the coast, plundering as they went. The viceroy's son had waged a savage campaign to prove to his father that he was truly worthy of his name. But more than title or riches, Lourenço wanted redemption. Now, it has to be said that the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean had been disruptive, to say the least. Make no mistake, there would be consequences to those actions. Many cities remained hostile, and there were even rumors of a vast Muslim fleet that had arrived. But no one in the Portuguese High Command could confirm this. Indeed, even Francisco de Almeida, the viceroy himself, had disregarded the reports of this fleet as nothing more than a story. As a result, Lourenço and his crews were essentially idle and bored. Many were simply spending their money on wine and other indulgences that the city of Chaul could provide. They had nothing to do but wait for their merchantmen to fill their ships with spice and then escort them back to the city of Cochin. The mood was calm, and thus Lourenço's ships were positioned lazily in the middle of the Kundalika River. However, that said, it was about midday towards the end of March when a series of ships appeared on the horizon. Even to the casual observer, one could tell they were moving in fast under full sail. But the ships were not Arabian or Indian in design, rather they appeared to be European, thus any sense of alarm was put aside. Some of the sailors even began to yell out in joy. They figured this was yet another fleet from Portugal. I mean, after all, Afonso de Albuquerque and his ships were actually scheduled around that time to meet them. But still, something seemed off. Why were they moving in so quickly? One judicious pilot, using a telescope, noted that the rigging on these ships was very different than what they were used to. And then, the dawning realization hit him. This inbound fleet didn't have red crosses on their sails. They had crescents. Far from being a Portuguese fleet, this was the vanguard of the fabled, disregarded Muslim Armada. Panic and terror spread through Lourenço's ships like wildfire as men sounded alarms, raced to ready cannons, and adorned themselves with armor. Then, suddenly, behind the vanguard, even more ships appeared, too many to easily count. As the two fleets closed in and prepared for battle, it became clear to Almeida and his men that the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean was now going to be seriously contested. Jihad had arrived. Now, halfway around the world, the Republic of Venice was in a state of crisis. The lifeblood of its monopoly on spice was being drained away. Vasco da Gama's discovery of the sea passage to India had opened up a brand new way to bring in the extremely lucrative commodity. At first, the Venetians bet on the idea that the long route to India would prove either too dangerous or too impractical. But Portuguese determination proved them wrong. Year after year, the spice fleets came back again and again and again. The money that this brought in was beyond insane, and in record time, Lisbon became the new Venice. To their credit, for the first couple of years, the Republic of Venice tried diplomacy. Let's make a deal. Perhaps we could, split the money. Yeah, that would miserably fail. So they decided to recall their ambassador and send in the spies. One agent in particular would give both a concerning report and a subtle hint to his masters back in Venice on what to do. Quote, "I see that this enterprise in India cannot be destroyed by the inability to sail there. It goes on as a regular and stable business, and without doubt the King of Portugal will dominate the sea completely, because it's patiently obvious that the Indians cannot protect their maritime trade, nor resist the shipping or artillery of this most serene king. There is no doubt that the ships of India are weak for no other reason than the lack of cannons." End quote. By 1505, the situation for the Venetians had gone from bad to horrific. Portugal was not just cornering the market on spice, but doubling down on its Indian empire. In response, the Republic tried to lower its prices and thus beat the Iberian Kingdom in a trade war. That didn't work either. They couldn't lower their prices enough. They then turned to the Mamluks in Egypt. They tried to convince them to lower their import taxes, but the Egyptian Sultanate basically subsisted almost parasitically on its tariffs. Yup, another fail. Now, there was even an instance in order to facilitate trade that the leader of Venice, the Doge, Leonardo Loredan, proposed to the Sultan to build a canal to connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea at a narrow point, perhaps at the port of Suez. The Sultan, however, found the idea not to his liking. The cost would be enormous, the manpower needed ridiculous. And besides, what on earth would you even call such a waterway? The Canal of Suez? Absolutely preposterous. Completely exasperated, the Republic of Venice decided it was now time to play dirty. The Portuguese had committed numerous atrocities on the Muslims of the Indian Ocean. After all, ships had been raided, towns had been burned to the ground, and holy war had been conducted. But all of this paled in comparison to the absolute brutality that was seen with the destruction of the Muslim pilgrim ship, the Miri, whose barbaric and violent end still shocked all that heard the tale, and gave rise to the very legitimate concern that Mecca itself was in danger. As can be imagined, there was a lot of resentment, and the Venetians, well, they were going to simply capitalize on this. The Doge and his high council now pushed diplomatically to get the Egyptian Sultanate to act. They pointed out that the Mamluks, who had jurisdiction over Mecca and Medina, were truly defenders of the faith. With the Portuguese expanding over the Indian Ocean like a plague, the pilgrimage, the Hajj itself, was at stake. Something had to be done. But the Mamluks were not a maritime power, but that was not going to be a problem because Venice was determined to make them one. Advisors and engineers laden down with European ship schematics were deployed to the port of Suez, which was built into an impressive shipyard. Sailors were trained to man the ships, and more importantly, to fire Venetian-style cannons, which did have the capacity to bring down other European ships. Even raw materials would be taken care of. Roger Crowley, in the book The Conquerors, gives the tale, quote, "It became obvious that materials for both ship and cannon construction were being assembled for a concerted campaign. King Manuel received warning of this via the island of Rhodes, where one of the Knights of St. John, a Portuguese by the name of André do Amaral, fed information on the Mamluks back to Lisbon. The Portuguese would later claim that the ships in the dockyards of Suez were being built with timber that was cut, dressed, and supplied by the Venetians. To make matters worse, their construction was overseen by Venetian officials. However, when the Portuguese ambassador at the English court of Henry VIII put such charges against his Venetian opposite in the summer of 1517, these accusations were flatly denied. End quote. By the winter of 1505, 6 European carracks and 6 galleys had been built. And keep in mind, all of them were carrying some of the finest cannons that could be produced. Then, 1,100 of the Sultan's men boarded the ships, and with several more support vessels, the Mamluk Armada began its voyage down the Red Sea. Now, meanwhile, on the other end of the Mediterranean, King Manuel had lost faith in his viceroy. His advisors and members of the high nobility had convinced him that Francisco de Almeida was no longer a man to be trusted. The king's opinion of Almeida had thus shifted from mistrust to outright contempt. It was only a few months after the Mamluk Armada had departed from the port of Suez that the Portuguese king had appointed Almeida's replacement. Alfonso de Albuquerque was given the title governor and was instructed to take over in India. A fleet had been prepared, consisting of 15 ships, which departed from Portugal on April 5, 1506. However, the governor had to share it with his co-commander, Diogo da Cunha, who was technically supposed to be in charge. The two men hated one another right from the start. Alfonso, who was convinced of the supremacy of his own abilities, disdained the idea of having to report to anyone. Their mutual contempt only intensified as they made their way first through the Atlantic, then around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually along the East African coast. The fleet took its time. It looted and raided as it went. What's more, Cunha took it upon himself to explore Madagascar. Thus, it took them 16 months to arrive at their first objective, the island of Socotra at the entrance of the Red Sea. Here in late August of 1507, the Muslim garrison was stormed, and the island was taken after a brutal campaign of extermination. Socotra was to be the location of the next Portuguese base, with the intent to blockade Arabian commerce coming in from the Red Sea. However, it would turn out to be a disaster as the island could not support its Portuguese garrison, and 4 years later, it had to be abandoned. Regardless, at this point, Albuquerque and Cunha had had enough of each other. Taking the best ships and equipment, Diogo decided to sail off to India. Albuquerque, meanwhile, decided to disregard his orders to block off the Red Sea. Instead, he took the remaining 6 ships and sailed along the southern coast of Arabia towards the Persian Gulf. His plan was to destroy all resistance. Roger Crowley gives us the account of how this campaign went down. Quote, "It was here in a few short weeks on the southeast coast of Arabia that Albuquerque founded a reputation that was exceptional within the ranks of the Portuguese conquistadors, and that would be cemented in its history as he gained the singular title, the Terrible." One after another, his fleet of tattered ships sailed into the trading ports of Oman. Some of the ports along the Omani coast decided to submit meekly, others resisted and were sacked. Albuquerque would use terror as a weapon of war intended to soften up resistance. In this fashion, a string of small ports went up in flames. The destruction of Muscat, which was a major trading hub along the coast, was especially savage. Albuquerque was intent on transmitting terror ahead of him. He ordered the ears and noses of the captured Muslims to be cut off, and then sent them to Hormuz as a testament to their disgrace. End quote. In this way, cities from Muscat to Khor Fakkan were either sacked or taken, but the real prize was the city of Hormuz. Hormuz was a major trading hub of spice and also happened to control the entrance to the Persian Gulf. It was a fabulously wealthy city that had even been visited by the famous Chinese treasure ships of the Ming Dynasty. Alfonso arrived with his ragged fleet on September 25, 1507. He made a poor first impression. That said, 2 days later, he crushed a large contingent of Muslim ships in the harbor. The vizier of the city sued for peace and agreed to pay tribute. Alfonso was not satisfied. He insisted on the construction of a fortress. But by now, his men's anger at his harsh methods had reached a boiling point. 4 of his captains mutinied and departed with their ships. When the Portuguese governor heard of this, he flew into a rage. He ordered all the wells to be poisoned, the city bombarded, and every man, woman, and child to be executed. but these orders were too barbaric for even his own men to follow. Facing a full-on mutiny and a major native uprising in Ormuz, Afonso de Albuquerque was forced to retreat in January of 1508, but make no mistake, he'd be back for his prize. However, as he was gaining the title of the Terrible in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea was left wide open. Amir Hussein al-Kurdi was the admiral of the Mamluk Armada. After departing the port of Suez at the end of 1505, he made his way slowly through the Red Sea. The man did have many objectives. His first destination was Jeddah, which controlled the sea approaches to Mecca. Here, Amir Hussein took his time to reinforce the city, improve its defenses, and assemble a garrison. Jeddah was to be a fortress. If the Portuguese were to arrive, the admiral was determined that they would face a challenge. But Mecca was still not secure. Arabia was in turmoil. Many of the Bedouin tribes at this point had risen up in revolt. Hussein marched his forces into the unforgiving sands of the Arabian Peninsula, systematically crushing this revolt, which took nearly a year. The Bedouin, after all, were a fierce adversary. They would exact a high toll in terms of casualties. Undaunted, the admiral pushed on and arrived at the city of Aden in August of 1507, just about the same time that Albuquerque was sacking the Omani coast. Now, during his time in the Red Sea, he consistently got reports of Portuguese atrocities in the Indian Ocean. He knew it was now time to bring the fight to them. Departing Aden, Amir Hussein made his way to the city of Diu. He found it rather strange that the vaunted Portuguese navy was nowhere to be seen. It was in September of 1507 when he arrived in India. At Diu, he would harbor his ships where they would undergo refit and repair. Here, Amir awaited for the opportunity to strike, and 6 months later, he got word that the viceroy's son was at Chaul with a meager force. The Mamluk ships were readied for battle. Amir Hussein even convinced the governor of the city of Diu, Malik Ayaz, to join him with the city's navy. Thus, the combined fleet, consisting of both the Mamluk Armada and the ships of Diu, made their way to confront the son of the viceroy. The Mamluk fleet had managed to enter the harbor of Chaul. Amir Hussein had placed his European-style ships at the front of his formation to gain the element of surprise. It had worked. His vanguard had closed the distance to bring their cannons to bear. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were still scrambling to make their ships worthy of battle. Hussein sailed past the helpless merchant ships of Cochin as his target came into sight. His plan was to tactically decapitate his opponent by destroying Lorenzo's flagship, the São Miguel, which was dangerously anchored midstream with only the São Antonio nearby for support. The lead Muslim ships opened up on the two vessels. Several of the cannonballs missed their mark, but two smashed into the hull of the São Miguel, blasting a hole right through. The rest of the Mamluk ships moved in to close rank. Turkish archers came to the main deck and began firing their arrows, that a chronicler would later recall seemed to fall like rain. On board Lorenzo's flagship, 30 men out of a crew of approximately 100 were hit. Blood began to bathe the Portuguese decks, but by then, Lorenzo and his men were ready to fight back. Crossbowmen ran to take cover and unleashed a salvo of bolts. They were quickly reinforced by sailors armed with guns. Then suddenly, the air was shattered by explosions. Crowley gives the account, quote, "The Portuguese gunners now had sufficient time to prime their cannons and loose off their own counterblast. In the shattering roar of the guns, both Portuguese ships vanished in the gun smoke and reappeared. 8 shots from the São Miguel hit the lead Muslim ship, which was crowded with 400 fighting men. The cannonballs ripped through the closely packed ranks, shattering armor, dismembering bodies. Splinters of wooden shrapnel only increased the carnage. The deck was a scene of chaos, and it was at this point that Hussein changed his mind about attempting to board his opponent." End quote. Amir Hussein altered his course to move beyond the São Miguel. As he scanned the scene, he saw the rest of the Portuguese ships coming in to assist. The two fleets then formed into battle lines, and for the next several hours they fired back and forth into one another. Eventually, both sides were exhausted, but it was only when the sun set that the fighting ground to a halt. The Mamluks, who had taken horrendous losses and were now low on gunpowder, retreated to one bank of the river. The Portuguese, who had also been bloodied, retreated to the other bank. The two opponents were now separated by a mere 1,500 feet of water. The ships of Diu, however, had not entered the fight. The governor, Mamluk-Venetian, kept his fleet back at the mouth of the river. Malik was a shrewd man, some would argue a bit underhanded. He wanted to see how things played out before deciding which side to back up, and for him, this first day was a draw. The next day, as the sun arose, Lorenzo saw that the Mamluks had positioned their vessels side by side with the front of their ships pointing into the river. What's more, they had been chained together, and gangplanks had been put down so that men and equipment could be moved back and forth between the ships. Seeing this, Lorenzo de Almeida could not believe how foolish his opponent was. It was obvious that the Muslims now had European ships, but it was also obvious that they had no idea how to properly use them. By adopting this formation, Amir Hussein had negated his ability to move, to maneuver, or even to bring his broadsides to bear. He had thus lost the initiative and made himself the perfect target. Lorenzo immediately convened with his men. There were really two options that they could use. The first option was to bombard the Mamluks from a distance, something that the Portuguese were really good at. And the fact that their opponent wasn't really moving, well, they could probably do this blindfolded. Option 2 was to move in and take the enemy ships by direct assault, that is, to board and capture them, by far the much riskier venture. Lorenzo gave it considerable thought, but he was a man who was still haunted by his failure at the City of Diu. If he was able to capture those ships and bring them back as trophies, it would bring him not only glory, but perhaps the redemption he so eagerly desired. In the end, Lorenzo wanted nothing more than to prove to his father that he was indeed courageous and worthy of his family name. Option 2 it would be. Lorenzo de Almeida decided to strike at Amir Hussein's flagship. The plan was for them to pull up alongside, grapple the enemy ship, and board it. The rest of the Portuguese ships would come in to provide support and suppress the remainder of the Muslim fleet. It wasn't until the early afternoon that the winds were favorable, but on the incoming breeze, Lorenzo and his men launched themselves into the attack. The Mamluk fleet had taller ships, so using that advantage, they immediately opened up with a deadly attack of arrows and cannon fire. Despite taking damage, the Portuguese kept their guns silent as they moved in to seize Hussein's fleet. But then, as they came within 30 feet, the wind died, and Lorenzo and his men were at the mercy of the river current. When Amir Hussein saw what his opponent was up to, he masterfully ordered his men to give slack to the forward anchor lines and tighten the aft anchor lines. This effectively drew his ships back toward the riverbank and out of range for the Portuguese to grapple them. The São Miguel and her sister's ship began to drift past their objective. They both dropped their anchors to maintain their position, but this made them easy stationary targets for the Mamluks. Lorenzo and his men knew that they had failed in their attack. They suggested to their commander to open up with their cannons and obliterate the Muslims at point-blank range. Once again, Lorenzo wanted a prize to present to his father, and he refused to do a broadside. To show his commitment, he came to the bridge of his ship to command his men directly. Hussein, meanwhile, took advantage of the situation. He ordered more archers to come to the top deck and intensified the hail of arrows. One arrow would graze Lorenzo, while another hit him directly in the lower face. Blood gushed from his wounds as he fell to his knees. In pain, the young Almeida ordered the anchor line to be cut. The São Miguel and the São Antonio thus drifted away downstream. Now on the other side of the line, the Portuguese fleet was doing considerably better. 2 galleys and a small caravel rammed into the Mamluk ships. Their crews, protected by chainmail armor and steel breastplates, rushed over and boarded the anchored ships. The onslaught was fierce. They brought down the Muslim defenders with ease, and the oarsmen, who were chained to their posts, were rapidly cut down like grass. Men that attempted to run away were gunned down, and men that attempted to dive overboard were harpooned. The Portuguese then used the gangplanks to proceed from one ship to the next. At this point, it wasn't so much a battle, but a massacre. During the onslaught, anchor lines were cut and 4 of the Mamluk ships were towed away. The São Miguel and the São Antonio, meanwhile, provided fire support as best they could as the enemy galleys were seized. Lourenço then wanted his men to come in for a second attack. Again, he rejected the idea of bombardment. However, his men were exhausted and now the situation had taken a turn for the worse. Malik Ayaz had finally decided to join the fight on the side of the Mamluks. His ships entered the river and took up position on the southern bank. The Portuguese were now nearly surrounded and opted to abandon any further attack. Their tactical situation had now become critical. It was that night that Lourenço, still recovering from his wounds, decided along with his men to depart the city of Chaul. He did, after all, have his prizes of war, and the protection of the Cochin merchant ships was their first priority. At midnight, the ships of Cochin silently cut their anchor lines and began to leave, at which point the Portuguese started to follow them. Lourenço insisted that he and his ship, the São Miguel, would be the last to go. But by now, Amir Hussein and Malik Ayaz had figured out that their adversary was fleeing. Their fleets sprung into action. The Portuguese ships, knowing that they had been discovered, opened up with their cannons. They managed to keep the Mamluks at a distance with their gunfire. However, the São Miguel, which was towing another ship, began to drag behind. Lourenço, who had brought up the rear, was soon isolated. Malik Ayaz moved in quickly with his ships. When he was in firing range, he ordered them to target the São Miguel. His cannons were smaller, but one lucky shot hit the São Miguel, gouging a hole near the waterline. The bottom deck of Lourenço's ship thus began flooding. Men attempted frantically to pump out the water, but the São Miguel was carrying rice in its hold, which absorbed the incoming water like a sponge. The added weight slowed down the ship and eventually brought her to a standstill. In time, the São Miguel even began to list to one side. Now, while the Mamluks and the forces of Diu were closing in for the kill, Lourenço's men were preparing a longboat for him to escape, but he would decline it. As water continued to seep in, the São Miguel was boarded. In the book, The Conquerors, the scene is told, quote, "It was mayhem aboard the São Miguel. Cannonballs were smacking into the immobilized vessel. Clouds of arrows buzzed and whined through the air. Thick gun smoke obscured the increasingly defenseless ship. The defenders beat off the first and second attempt aboard. They fought like men who wanted revenge before they died. But the ship was being destroyed around them. The deck was a shambles, littered with dead and dying men. Dismembered heads and legs, blood running down the planks. And everywhere there was shouting and screaming." End quote. Despite the chaos that surrounded him, Lourenço continued to command his men. But then, suddenly, a cannonball hit him directly in the thigh, cutting his leg completely off. His men raced to his side and lowered him into a chair. There, he would begin to bleed profusely onto the deck. His suffering, however, would not be for long. Another cannonball hit him in the chest, and this one would kill him instantly. Fighting aboard the São Miguel would continue for hours. The men of Portugal fought tenaciously, and a third, fourth, and fifth wave were beaten off. Indeed, a man from Porto who climbed into the crow's nest held his position there for 2 days, till he was granted amnesty to leave. When the bloodshed had ended, some of the Portuguese men were taken as prisoners. Others were executed. However, before the end, Lourenço's men took his body, and fearing that it would become a trophy for the enemy, pushed it from an opening where the weight of his armor sank it to the bottom of the Kundalika River. His remains would never be recovered. Amir Hussein and his allies had won the Battle of Chaul, but his victory was Pyrrhic as it came at a staggering cost in terms of men and ships. He had lost nearly 800 men from a crew of 1,400, and he was so weakened that he could not push on to attack the Portuguese stronghold at Cochin. News of the Portuguese defeat and the death of Lourenço was celebrated as far as Cairo, but Amir Hussein and Malik Ayaz had no idea what they had just unleashed. When Francisco de Almeida received word of the death of his only son, he went into a state of profound grieving, as the Spanish would say, a tristeza profunda. For 3 whole days, he saw no one. Francisco was a man who had given everything for his country, and now that included his only son. He was a man that was consumed by a sense of duty. But when he emerged from his time in mourning, the only thing he had left in his soul was a profound sense of vengeance. My name is Francisco de Almeida. You killed my only son. Prepare to die. It had been 9 months since the Battle of Chaul, 9 months since the Portuguese were forced to flee, 9 months since Francisco de Almeida's only son, Lourenço, had perished. Chaul had been a disaster for the Portuguese. It was now clear to all that the Europeans could be beaten. Perhaps they could be destroyed altogether. However, the Mamluk Armada had only won a Pyrrhic victory. It had taken horrendous losses, and along with its allies, they were forced to limp their way back to the City of Diu. Almeida knew that if Chaul was not avenged and quickly, his enemies would only grow stronger and bolder. The Portuguese Empire in India, with its vast wealth and spice, would be severely threatened, and there was even potential that it could fall entirely. But the Mamluks had made a grave mistake. They had only killed the son of the viceroy. As Francisco would later say, he who eats the chicken must also eat the rooster, or pay the price. It wasn't long after the Battle of Chaul in early 1508 that the monsoons had come. Storms ravaged the Malabar coast. Any naval expedition would simply have to wait. The Viceroy of India wasted no time. He began to assemble a grand fleet, bringing in every ship he could find. Francisco spent that year personally training his crews to the peak of performance. He was determined to make his men into killing machines. By December of 1508, he had 18 ships and 1,200 men. They all seemed to share a sense of vengeance with their commander, who had promised them knighthood, plunder, amnesty, and even pardon for those on the bottom rung. Make no mistake, for Almeida, this wasn't just about fighting for his king and for his country. This coming fight was deeply personal. However, Francisco knew that he was running out of time. The King of Portugal, Manuel I, had obviously lost favor in him. Every month, an envoy would arrive from Portugal with an unending list of royal grievances. It was absolutely clear that Almeida's rivals in the royal court of Lisbon had been busy turning the king against him. King Manuel now wanted Almeida not just replaced, but sent home in utter disgrace. Regardless, Francisco continued his preparations. He dutifully sent the spice ships back to Portugal, and by early December of 1508, his war fleet was nearly ready to sail. As the date of his departure came near, he composed a letter to the king which outlined his plan. In the words he wrote, it was obvious that this, for him, was both a personal and a holy war. Indeed, his letter read almost like a final will and testament. Quote, I have a great desire to write to your highness, as I have determined to leave a memory. Whatever happens to me, my son is dead, as God willed and my sins deserved. The Venetians and the Sultan's Muslims killed him. It seems to me that this year we cannot avoid a trial of strength with them, which is the thing I most desire, because it seems to me that with God's help we have to remove them totally from the sea, so that they do not return to this land. And if our Lord is served by my ending my days in this way, I will have obtained the rest I seek, to see my son in glory. End quote. Almeida finished his letter on December 5, 1508 on board the Flor de la Mar. He knew that this coming battle would forever shape the fortunes of Portugal and India. The man resigned himself to the fight ahead. In his mind, he was prepared to die. The next day, December 6, 1508, the Viceroy of India walked sternly up to the bridge of his ship, the Flor de la Mar, or in Portuguese, the Frol de la Mar. The massive 400-ton carrack was a legend in the Portuguese Navy. She had made the India run more times than any other ship. She had been under the command of Vasco da Gama when he bombarded Calicut, participated in the capture of the island of Socotra, and her journey was far from over. The Flor de la Mar was now a massive gun platform and the flagship of Almeida's armada, but as fate would have it, she was soon to be a commandeered ship, as Francisco de Almeida was soon to be a fugitive. It was on this very day that Alfonso de Albuquerque, who was coming in from his defeat at the city of Ormuz in the Persian Gulf, arrived in India. Albuquerque first pulled into port at Kannur, but eventually made his way down to Cochin. In his hand was a letter from King Manuel appointing him the next governor. Almeida's time was up. The meeting between the two commanders was going to be awkward at best. Alfonso, despite his fierce personality, tried to be polite in taking over command. Francisco, however, held Alfonso in complete contempt as he had abandoned his position in the Red Sea, thereby allowing the Mamluk fleet to enter the Indian Ocean. This basically implied that he felt Alfonso de Albuquerque was in part responsible for his son's death. As expected, Francisco de Almeida refused to step down, stating that his position as viceroy didn't end until January. Furthermore, he argued he was about to engage the enemy. Alfonso, on the other hand, wasn't going to back down either, and insisted that he be the one to take command of the fleet and hunt down the Mamluk armada himself. A massive confrontation that would drag the Portuguese into civil war was about to happen. But then, suddenly, on December 9th, Alfonso de Albuquerque awoke in Cochin to find both the viceroy and his armada gone. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors explains, quote, Almeida had sailed up the west coast of India, impelled by powerful forces both personal and strategic. However, in refusing to cede the governorship of India to Albuquerque, he was now openly disobeying the king. He was convinced that a showdown with the Egyptian fleet was necessary for the security of the Portuguese enterprise. At the same time, he sought revenge. But whatever the consequences for himself, if he ever made it back to Lisbon, he had decided to take the law into his own hands. End quote. The Portuguese armada that sailed from Cochin under the command of Francisco de Almeida in late 1508 was the best trained and equipped fleet that Portugal had yet brought to bear. As it made its way up the Malabar coast, it raided and looted and destroyed any enemy it encountered. Its passage was to be a demonstration of power. By late December, Francisco de Almeida had arrived at the city of Diu, the place where his son had failed to attack in 1506. It was a very wealthy city that had sided with his enemies in the past, and as such, Almeida was determined that it would serve as an example to those who would dare to defy the Portuguese. As the city of Diu came into view, Francisco told his captains that they would not only have to capture the city, but as he himself would say, they needed to instill terror in the enemy so that they remained completely traumatized. In the viceroy's mind, they had helped to kill his son. He wanted them to be more than just defeated. He wanted them to be broken. What's more, he wanted that terror to be transmitted to all of his adversaries who were still laying in wait. He wanted his qualities known amongst his enemies before he ever met them. Roger Crowley gives the account of the massacre that ensued. Quote, Almeida's captains obeyed his instructions to the letter. On December 31st at dawn, his ships launched a heavy bombardment alongside simultaneous amphibious landings. The wooden walls of the city soon fell, and as the garrison fled in disarray, the Portuguese pursued them. What followed was a black day in the history of European conquest that would leave the Portuguese cursed on Indian soil. Taken by surprise, the people of the city fled in all directions. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Women and men, young and old, all went down before the sword. Little children were ripped from the arms of their terrified mothers, dangled by their feet, and dashed against walls. In places, resistance was valiant but futile." End quote. The city was systematically looted and then burned to the ground. People that had taken shelter in basements and mosques were incinerated alive. The massacre of Diu would live forever in the memories of the few people who survived. It would rank alongside Vasco da Gama's destruction of the pilgrim ship the Miri. With his work done, Almeida departed Diu on January 5, 1509. The fleet made its way north and soon arrived at the city of Chaul, where his son had died. A large tribute was demanded from the city, and it was amassed without question. A pile of gold was waiting for the viceroy when he arrived, but when his forces disembarked to collect it, they found the entire city was empty. Everyone had fled. Almeida's shock and awe was clearly having the effect he wanted. By late January of 1509, Francisco had moved on to the island of Mombasa to repair and refit his ships before the final push on Diu. All 18 of his ships and 1,200 of his men had survived thus far. It was here that he got a letter from Mamluk-Venetian, the governor of Diu, who had participated at the Battle of Chaul. Keep in mind, it was Malik's men who most likely had killed Francisco's son. Now that said, the loyalty of Mamluk-Venetian was still up for grabs, and he was ready to cut a deal with the Portuguese. He offered friendship, money, tribute, and the return of the prisoners he had taken at Chaul. Malik even revealed the composition of the Mamluk fleet, hoping to persuade the viceroy. Francisco de Almeida's response, however, was not quite what Malik was expecting. Quote, "I, the Viceroy, address you, the most honorable Mamluk-Venetian, to let you know that I am on my way to your city, to seek out the men sheltering there after fighting with mine at Chaul and killing a man known to be my son. I am coming with the hope of God on high to wreak vengeance on them and to those who help them. And if I don't find them, your city will not escape me. It will repay me for everything, and so will you, who gave them such great help at Chaul. I am informing you of this so that you are fully aware of it when I arrive. Know that I am on my way." End quote. The city of Diu was blessed with a magnificent harbor. There was space for hundreds of ships. Inside were impressive dry dock facilities. At the entrance, there was a chain that spanned the water, and there was even multiple shore batteries that provided protection. The Mamluk admiral, Emir Hussein al-Kurdi, had 6 Mamluk galleys and 6 European-style carracks. His ally, the aforementioned governor of the city, Mamluk-Venetian, had 30 light galleys and 4 Gujarati carracks. Their strength had also been bolstered by reinforcements. The Zamorin, the king of the city of Calicut, who really wanted to see the Portuguese go down, had sent in an additional 100 smaller ships. Altogether, there were over 140 vessels that held 5,000 fighting men, along with 450 elite Mamluk warriors. However, despite their superiority in numbers, their leadership was heavily divided by mistrust and indecisiveness with tactical planning. Emir Hussein, who had struggled to keep his ships seaworthy and to keep his men from deserting, wanted to sail out and engage the Portuguese on the ocean before they could organize into a battle formation. Mamluk-Venetian and the Zamorin ships, which were less seaworthy, wanted to fight in the harbor where they'd be more effective and be safeguarded by the shore batteries. Malik also wanted to protect his city and felt that the Mamluks would most likely cut and run if they were to leave the waterfront. Eventually, after a lot of infighting, the commanders decided that they would fight within the confines of the city. On February 2, 1509, the Portuguese came into sight. They were exhausted from their long voyage, and so they kept their distance to rest and consolidate their tactical formation. Mamluk-Venetian ordered his men to sail out and harass their enemy, but they never ventured past the range of their shore batteries, which basically gave the Portuguese time to organize. The next day, February 3rd, the wind shifted into favor at approximately 11 a.m. Everyone in the Portuguese fleet knew exactly what that meant. Francisco de Almeida ordered the royal standard raised and a single cannon to be fired on the Flor de la Mar. This was his signal to attack. The Mamluks had adopted a similar tactical formation as they had at the Battle of Chaul. Along the shoreline near the entrance to the harbor, they had anchored their ships side by side closely together in a static position. Here they would not only be protected by the guns of the city and the fort of Diu, but they would also be able to provide close support for one another. Yet by adopting this formation, they had completely surrendered the initiative to the Portuguese viceroy. Malik Ayaz and the ships of Calicut, meanwhile, remained further back in the harbor. Malik had wagered that Almeida, like his son, would immediately attack the Mamluk ships, engaging them at point-blank range with grappling hooks and boarding parties and avoiding long-range bombardment. His plan was to come in on the flank and the rear of the Portuguese once they were heavily engaged with the Mamluks. Now, oddly enough, Malik had intentionally not raised the heavy chain that protected the harbor, which would have effectively banned the Portuguese from entering. Some historians argue that Malik did this as he was still trying to gain Almeida's favor. Looking on from his bridge, the Portuguese viceroy astutely took in the tactical and strategic scenario. He knew this would be a pivotal battle, as he was later remembered saying to his men, "Be certain that in conquering this fleet, we will conquer all of India." Then as he and his men uttered the cry, "Santiago," the Portuguese fleet moved in. Seeing their adversary approach, the shore batteries were primed and began to open fire. The lead ship, the Santo Espirito, took several direct hits. The men on its forward deck were killed instantly. As the rest of the ships came into range, they too came under intense cannon fire. But despite taking casualties and being shot at from several sides, they pushed on and made their way into the main harbor. Almeida knew he was outnumbered, so he divided his fleet into several attack groups. Each had been instructed in exactly what to do. The first group was instructed to bombard the enemy at a distance. They trained their cannons to shoot directly into the water. The cannonballs thus bounced over the waves like skipping stones and slammed into the Mamluk ships just above the waterline. The second group was commanded to move in, grapple, and then board the Muslim ships. This contingent was led by the Santo Espirito, which pulled up alongside the ship next to Emir Hussein's flagship. The Santo Espirito unleashed a devastating broadside at point-blank range. Cannonballs tore through her target. The Mamluk ship receiving the fire shuddered from the blast, keeled over, and immediately began to sink, drowning everyone on board. The rest of the second group of ships closed in and repeated this maneuver, blasting their assigned targets at close range. But then a deafening roar came from both sides as Hussein's men began to return fire. Smoke billowed out from all the ships, blotting out the sun. Casualties began to mount on both sides, but the Mamluks, despite having skilled gunners, were limited by their formation and being able to unleash their full broadsides. It was at this point that the Portuguese had moved into position to begin grappling and boarding their opponents. The Santo Espirito attempted to board Hussein's flagship, but just as Portuguese soldiers started to go across, an Egyptian carrack, using its anchor lines, moved in and sandwiched the Portuguese ship, which now had to take up a defensive position and came near to being captured. However, the nearby Rey Grande, seeing this unfold, changed course and rammed Hussein's ship on the other side. Emir Hussein's men raced to confront the new threat, and the battle shifted once again into Portugal's favor. All along the line, broadsides were being unleashed, men were fighting hand-to-hand, and arrows and small gunfire filled the air. Malik Ayaz, meanwhile, watched on, from a distance, on the shore. Even from his vantage point, he could tell that the Portuguese tactics and maneuverability were slowly winning the day. Almeida's men may have been outnumbered, but their cannons, not to mention their plate and chain armor, had made them near invincible. One Mamluk ship after another was being overwhelmed with the ferocity of the Portuguese attack. It was at this point that Malik finally gave the order for his ships, along with his Calicut allies, to sail in on the Portuguese rear. Perhaps there was still a chance he could turn the tide. Francisco de Almeida, however, had anticipated this. He had created one last battle group which consisted of two ships, the Flor de la Mar and the São Antonio. He had kept his flagship back at a distance in the middle of the harbor where he could better take in the entire fight and give commands to his men. The São Antonio was deployed midway as a communication ship that conveyed his orders directly to his men. But the Flor de la Mar was directly positioned in this way to intercept the ships of Diu and Calicut. It was essentially one ship against many, but as this fleet moved in, the Flor de la Mar opened up on them. The initial broadsides were so violent that they shook Almeida's flagship to its core. Wooden beams groaned and the mighty ship began to come apart. Francisco immediately deployed his men for damage control. He knew he had to repair his ship. If the Flor de la Mar sank, the battle would have been lost. Miraculously, the ship held together and continued to unleash one volley after another. As luck would have it, the wind shifted and the current began to slow down. This brought Malik's ships to a near standstill, a perfect target for experienced Portuguese gunners to take them down. Throughout the day, the Flor de la Mar continued to fire its broadsides. It was said that the flagship unloaded over 600 rounds. At one point, Almeida had inflicted so much damage that the floating remains of his opponent's ships became an obstacle. The incoming Gujarati Carracks were heavily damaged. Some were reduced to skeleton crews as their casualties skyrocketed. The ships at Calicut, meanwhile, only stood up to a volley or two before turning back and then retreating from the harbor altogether. The Flor de la Mar had effectively stopped this incoming fleet, in some places literally dead in their tracks. The fate of the Mamluk ships was now sealed. Fighting would continue down the line for the rest of the day. Amir Hussein's men did fight back ferociously. Indeed, a third of Almeida's men would be wounded. But the tide of battle had definitively shifted. The Portuguese were handing out death wholesale. A chronicler at the time would lament, "The sea was red with the blood of the dead." Eventually, even Amir Hussein's flagship was taken by a combined assault. The Mamluk admiral at the last moment decided to abandon ship and escaped in a longboat. Now only one Mamluk ship was left, the largest Carrack of the fleet. The Portuguese swarmed it. Their goal was no longer to capture it. This final fight was about annihilation. Every gun was aimed at the lone ship, and then Almeida's fleet hit it with everything they had. It took several volleys, but finally the last ship was reduced to burning splinters. The Battle of Diu was over. Almeida's victory was absolute. As the sun set on February 3, 1509, the Portuguese counted 32 dead and over 400 wounded. Many of their ships were heavily damaged. Their adversaries, on the other hand, had it much worse. Every Mamluk ship was captured or destroyed. 4 Gujarati Carracks were captured, and nearly 400 Mamluk warriors and 1,400 of Diu's men were killed. Francisco de Almeida, however, was not done. Crowley's account describes what is nothing less than bloodlust. Quote, Almeida did not want Diu. He considered it to be impossible to defend with his existing forces. Instead, he demanded substantial compensation and terrible revenge, which he got. Malik Ayaz had to surrender all the Mamluks he was sheltering in the city to a variety of ghastly fates. Some had their hands and feet chopped off. Others were burned alive in a great pyre. Some were tied to the mouth of cannons and blasted to pieces, or put shackled into captured ships that were sunk by gunfire. The city gates were then decorated with bloody rosaries of dismembered body parts. If the outcome of Diu was perhaps inevitable, its consequences were profound. It destroyed once and for all the credibility of the Mamluk sultans and Muslim hopes that the Portuguese could be swept from the sea. The Franks were to be in the Indian Ocean to stay. End quote. The true legacy and importance of the Battle of Diu is still debated, but it's hard to argue that it didn't have at least a few lasting ramifications. Some historians strongly feel that it set the stage for Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, which in turn would lead to one of the greatest trade empires in history. They'd go on to say that the trade routes that were established and the knowledge that was obtained set a new normal that would lead the way to globalization. What's more, every European power, either impressed or envious of Portugal's success, would be also keen to cash in on a similar experience. But perhaps it's best that we go back to 1509. Amir Hussein, the Mamluk admiral, would return to Egypt, ironically, on horseback. He'd eventually be given another command, but would be killed by his own first officer. The Mamluks would never again seriously threaten Portuguese interests. In time, they themselves would be conquered by the Ottomans in 1517. Malik Ayaz would live on as governor of Diu. He'd always be looking for a way, any way, to preserve his city. He would die there in 1522, surrounded by wealth and opulence. The Zamorin of Calicut retreated his forces after the Battle of Diu. His city would continue to be defiant against European expansion, but the days of Calicut being an independent power were numbered. Francisco de Almeida returned to Cochin an empty man. He had nothing left. His wife had died years before, his son was dead, and his revenge was complete. He relinquished his position as viceroy, and in December of 1509, when the winds were favorable, he departed India and was destined never to return. As he made his return journey, he knew that his status in the eyes of King Manuel were tarnished. If he made it back to Lisbon, he figured that at best he'd be facing political exile, and at worst, arrest, imprisonment, and even execution. But he was fated never to return to his homeland. In March of 1510, just beyond the Cape of Good Hope, he was killed by a native African tribe in a minor skirmish over cattle. His men managed to recover his body, and he was interred in a small, humble grave in Cape Town. However, it is said that a tombstone was made for him back in Portugal. His epitaph would read, "Here lies Dom Francisco de Almeida, Viceroy of India, who never lied and who never fled."